live once again. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, anyone watching live now or listening later, either in the video or the podcast platforms. It is my pleasure to be joined tonight by good friend of the channel, the fantasy thinker, Jared. How are you?
Good. How are you? I'm great.
I just love being here again tonight. And obviously, the guest star of the show tonight is line face scrivener extraordinaire, Dr. Oliver. How are you?
Doing well, thank you.
And I didn't mean any insult by that line face scrivener. You know why I'm saying that, but
I sure do.
If you could illustrate anyone listening or watching, please go ahead.
If I could turn around and show my the back of my T-shirt, I actually have that quote on the back of this one. So I don't know if it would show up, and I wouldn't line up very well. But that's what he basically said, that someday some line-faced scrivener is going to appreciate all of these biographical notes. And he wrote that in an essay. And he started off telling a little bit about his background and then completely went off and had nothing to do with his biography. So the essay wasn't very helpful.
So before we get stuck in the whole Robert T. Howard, and I'm sure people want to hear about Conan as well and stuff. So I know you work at university, but what did you do for a living? Was the 9-to-5 job?
I'm actually a college professor, and I teach criminal justice, mainly policing. So that prepared me well to write a biography of Robert E. Howard.
And so where is the point of contact between criminal policing and Robert T. Howard?
Yeah, there is really none. Although they do actually, in the conversation between him and Lovecraft, they have a back and forth in their letters about the police. And Lovecraft thinks they can absolutely do no wrong, whereas Howard is like, yeah, right. These people are corrupt. They're beating people, the third degree. And so it's an interesting exchange, but that's about it.
That is a really good point of conversation, but I'm hoping that this goes well today and you will come back for another round with past guest David Goodwin, who was an H.P. Lovecraft biographer, and we can have a chat about the whole Lovecraft circle. So fingers crossed things go well today.
Okay, that could be fun.
Exactly. Thank you. So what was your first contact with the works of Robert T. Howard? How did this biography come about?
Well, let's see. I was 11 years old. This is going way back. So this is 1979. And my parents had just divorced. And about 2 weeks later, I was living with my mom across town. And she said, I have to go to the mall. You have to go with me. And of course, I went kicking and screaming. I did not want to go to the mall. So we got there and she said, well, you can go off, meet me back here at like 4:00. Oh, well, this is different. I get to go off on my own. So I wandered around and eventually found this. It was a really eclectic, wonderful game store, RPG, bookstore, comic store. It was just a little bit of everything.
One of those.
And there were the Howard paperbacks edited by L. Sprague de Camp, the first two, Conan and Conan Cimmerian. And I was like, whoa. So I started reading and I was blown away, bought those two, went home, read them that night, reread them all week, and then begged my mom, can we go back to the mall this weekend? Can we go back to the mall? So we went a couple weeks later, and by that time I had not only my paper route money, I had my birthday money. I turned 12, and so I bought every Howard book I could find. And that's actually when I also discovered Dungeons and Dragons, because there was the Munster manual sitting on and I was like, ooh, this looks cool. So that's how it all started.
The 3-ring binder.
This is going way back.
Come on, Jared. Just for anyone watching now, show Dr. There you go.
Yo, classic.
Yeah. Let's see. I got mine somewhere. I guess they're in the
those were the days. Those were the days.
Yeah, they really were. I mean, it was wonderful because now I could actually play Conan, right?
Yes, you can. Yep.
Except I actually couldn't because I ended up being the DM because nobody else wanted to do that.
Same here.
Yeah.
For anyone not watching, Jared was holding a first edition copy of the Dungeon Master's Guide from Dungeons and Dragons first edition. Yeah.
Nice.
I also ended up DMing. I guess, that's the curse of, if you could string 3 sentences together, that's it. You were the DM, whether your stories were any good or not, isn't it?
Yep. So all I had to do was rely on Howard and just let them drive the stories, right? So it was a lot of fun.
I saw that you've written a lot of books. I saw you've written a lot of books about criminal justice and stuff like that.
Yeah, that's my main area is mainly policing and some history of policing. And
so what led to moving on to writing about Howard?
I know.
Because I mean, obviously you're a big fan. I mean, we all are, but that's an extra step to go from being a big fan to actually researching somebody's life and times.
Yeah. So let's see. I guess this was about 2006. I was finishing up a history book, just kind of a history of criminal justice text. And I had written the part about, August Vollmer, who is considered the father of American policing. He was a police chief in Berkeley, California, and 1 year on loan from Berkeley for LAPD. And that was in 23-24. So after I finished, I used all the same sources everybody uses. And I said, after I finish this, I want to read a good biography of August Vollmer. And I didn't find one. So I said, maybe I'll write one. And it took me about 2 years to figure out even how to write a biography. I read like over 100 biographies trying to figure out how they do it, what I like, what works. And so I figured out some things that I really enjoyed when I read biographies. So then it took me another 8 years to write the biography, to research and write the biography of August Vollmer. So that published in 2017, and I told my wife, and so a lot of this is really her, she gets credit or fault, depending on how people view the biography. I said, I spent 10 years trying to figure out how to write a biography, and I wrote one, and that was my first. And I said, I really kind of enjoyed that. I mean, it was a huge undertaking, but I enjoyed the challenge. And I said, I want to write another biography. And she said, okay, go ahead. But Vollmer was from California, so keep that in mind. She said, why don't you write about somebody from Texas? And of course, her motivation was not to spend so much money, because I spent a lot of money going back and forth to California. So I was like, okay, I mean, it's a valid point. So I started thinking about it, and, I made some lists. I'm like, no. I was thinking like some of the Texas Rangers, and I'm like, there's been so many books done. And I don't know. I couldn't find anybody. I said, the only person I would want to write a biography about that was from Texas is Robert E. Howard. And she said, well, why don't you go ahead and do that? And I said, well, he's not really criminal justice. And she said, so? I said, okay, I got licensed from my wife. I'll write the biography of Robert E. Howard. So it took me 8 years researching, gathering up the sources, trying to track everything down, and then starting the initial plotting and everything of, how I was going to structure it. And then from there, just the writing and editing and lots of editing. And recently, a couple people have found a few more mistakes. So
what were your sources, your primary sources, when you were researching the biography?
That's what came out of the reading the 100 biographies. The ones that I really liked and I thought really did an excellent job of really bringing the subject to life, making them like a real person, was they copiously quoted and cited, kept quoting from the subject. Mm-hmm. And with Howard, of course, having the letters, left behind, as well as all of his writing, I thought this is perfect. So I can quote from them. The second thing I figured out was people that knew the subject. That was extremely important because they often had a different perspective than the subject themselves. So I quote liberally from them as well. So this would be Novelyn Price, his only girlfriend, Tevis Clyde Smith, all of his buddies that, have written about him, that people that actually knew him. And then the third thing I discovered that I really enjoyed was context. I read a lot of biographies where they would just say something and then they would just move on. And I'm like, I don't know anything about that. So could you help me out a little bit? The biographies that gave context to things that were happening at the time period, or to explain why they would have done this at that time, I thought really did a good job of. And so those were the three things I wanted to incorporate. So my main sources were anybody that had talked about or, knew Howard, wrote about Howard, and then mainly the primary source was Howard's own writing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I've got one more question, and then Gerald will raise the bar. And I asked the same question from David Goodwin last conversation. Obviously, you are a Robert T. Howard fan. You told us how you met him when you were a kid, and those things, they tend to stick with you or touch you deeper than if you were to encounter them as an adult later in life. So did you approach this biography with a particular bias or with something that you wanted specifically to put across? Or did you fly into an open-minded, see what came up, and try not to be too judgmental about it? I don't know.
Yeah, there's always that question about the bias. And, I'm sure any time that you're writing about anything, bias is going to enter in. But I wasn't going to cover over any of the warts of, Robert E. Howard, or when I wrote about August Vollmer, any of, his problems and deficiencies and things like that. Where people always ask, what's the elevator pitch for your book? And in both cases early on, I didn't have one. And it took me a while doing the research to finally figure out what they were. And so with Howard, there's been a lot of talk about, and he states this, the reason in fact, it was in a letter to Lovecraft, and there was also one to Farnsworth Wright, who was the editor of Weird Tales. But he said the reason I became a writer was as a means to freedom. And then that's where the title of the exchange, the two volumes, one book, I guess, of the letters between Lovecraft and Howard, that's where the title came from, A Means to Freedom. And so writing was his means to freedom. And it did give him a lot more flexibility because he was his own boss. But the more I read, and I read through his collected letters multiple times over and over again, it wasn't just writing. It was almost his entire life. And there was one letter to Lovecraft where he said, the pursuit of personal freedom has been the the primary goal of my entire life. And I said, that explains Howard. Everything filtered through that lens of seeking his own freedom, I think was that was the key, I think, to understanding Howard.
Cool.
And freedom from what exactly? And anything in particular, or just a general sense of being able to do and think whatever he wanted?
Yeah, and not have anybody tell him. Even as a kid, he bristled at school, not so much because of the things they were teaching him, which some of them he dismissed and some of them he enjoyed and liked, but mainly because he had to sit there and he hated sitting there. He wanted to get up. He wanted to move around. If I had to go to the bathroom, why do I have to ask somebody? It was just, he bristled at the notion that somebody has control over him, and he hated that. And when he was growing up, his mom gave him, an enormous amount of freedom, and so did his dad. A lot of the stories he tells from his childhood, I used to go around with, a gun, and I would plink and shoot at everything. And then I moved into town and people started complaining about it. You can't do that in town, but they were taking away his freedom. So he always bristled at anything having to do with that.
Right. Go on, Jared.
Seems he didn't like being told what to do, basically.
Yeah, basically. So. And
That's
he had a bunch of jobs where the bosses told him what to do, and he quit. He said nope.
that's interesting. Yeah. And Howard had, of course, a very tragically short life. But what do you think is primal about his story that would warrant so much biographical data about him? Like, a lot of people talk about him, and other people have done biographies on him as well. And he's stuck around. His story is stuck around despite being very short, cut so short.
Mm-hmm.
And what is it about Howard that resonates through time here that like we don't hear? There's been plenty of fantasy authors from the 19th and early 20th century that we don't hear about as much as we do about Robert Howard. So what do you think it is about him specifically that's he stands out to be talked about as much as he is?
His writing and his imagination are just so good. I mean, the imagination, if you ever go to Cross Plains, Texas, the house is still there, and they have Howard Days every summer. First or second weekend in June, to align with the day that he died. And you go into this really small house, and you get to his room, which actually used to be a porch. So it is a really small room. I mean, think of a small walk-in closet, and that's basically his room, where he wrote most of his and imagined all of his characters, all of the fantasy, and then wrote from there. And it is just staggering that he could write so well, and he could have such an imagination to come up with all of this in his desolate kind of, the area where he lived. The other thing too was with his writing, I think Hemingway, his wife had written that Hemingway had once told her he knew the secret to writing, and the secret is in the poetry. If you understand poetry and you can write poetry, you can turn that into prose, and that's what makes good prose writing. And Howard, his poetry is phenomenal. And, there's a 3-volume collection from the Robert E. Howard Foundation on just his poetry, all his collected poetry. And, some of the early stuff, there's some stinkers, like the childhood kind of poetry, but most of it is it is fabulous. And because he could write that poetry, he could turn that into prose. And a lot of his stories, I mean, there are descriptions and scenes that read like prose poetry.
Thank you. I just got a question. I think it's a 2-step question, but I don't know how to formulate it. So I'm going to try first bit. The title of your book is Robert T. Howard, The Life and Times of a Texas Author. Now, is that remarking that he was Texan for a particular reason? Because coming from Europe, the image that we have of Texas is that caricature, of the, yeehaw cowboy type thing. So were you purposely trying to emphasize his Texas identity or culture? And if so, what is that? What does it mean to be a Texan author?
Yeah, my wife's mother was Italian, and she was from Lucca, Italy.
Lovely town.
And some of the family came over to visit us here in Texas. And when Sio Luciano landed, he's like, "Why is it green? Why are there trees here? I thought it was all desert. I've seen the movies."
That's right.
I think it's extremely important that that Texas.
Sorry, we all just got booted out, but we are back. I don't know what happened.
All right. Since he was a Texan, born and raised, and you see that color his writing because there's a little bit of him in most of his stories, and there's a little bit of Texas in most of the stories because, again, he's a Texan. And you have to keep in mind when, he was born 1906, he's not that far removed from the frontier. And he grew up talking to people that had actually lived on the Texas frontier, and now we're in their elderly years, and they were telling him and sharing with him stories. And a lot of those stories ended up being, the stories that he told. Mm-hmm. So Texas is extremely important. Plus, how many famous writers came out of Texas, especially, in the 1920s and the 1930s? Very few. Mm-hmm. So, and that was one of the things he told a friend of his. He said, most of the writers, they come out of, New York City, and that's where they write. And he said, I'm going to prove that you can be a Texas writer, and I can do it right here from Texas, and I can become, famous. Mm-hmm. Now, I don't think he knew that he was going to become as famous as he did, but he succeeded.
Certainly so. The second part of my question is, once again, because he predates Tolkien, he predates Liber, almost all those sword and sorcery. He sort of, I may be wrong, my ignorance talking. He sort of created that the blueprint for the sword and sorcery genre.
Yes, he did create it.
Now, most fantasy is sort of steeped in the Arthurian, European, medieval folklore legend. So how is it that someone from Texas is actually the person that, basically kickstarts the genre when you couldn't be any more removed from that European myth? And this is the bit I'm trying to understand.
He really enjoyed reading things of the supernatural, and most of the stuff that he could read at that time tended to be more Gothic. So there is a heavy Gothic influence from his reading that influences his writing. The thing is that Gothics, it's always typically a female character, and she has to get some kind of help from somebody, and it's usually, everybody runs scared, and, something happens that's creepy and supernatural, and they all get scared and run away. And Howard kind of turned it. What if, it's almost like, what if a Texan were in these situations? The Texan would pull out his guns and start shooting. Or if he didn't have guns, he'd start fighting. And if he didn't have either, he would do whatever it took with that kind of Texas mentality. And so he, by integrating that, as well as a bunch of other things, a little bit of Edgar Allan Poe, a little bit, which has Gothic roots as well. You start integrating all of these other things, Jack London and the style of writing and adventures, and that He-Man, bold adventurers, etc. All of that starts getting integrated into how, Howard started looking and writing, and that ultimately led to his creation of Sword and Sorcery.
Where did he tends to incorporate, of course, with his map of the world there. It kind of looks like Europe over Africa, over Asia squished in and all that stuff. And so he incorporates, his stories take place in many different places. Where did he get his learning about these various different cultures and stuff that he was trying to somewhat inspired by to put into his stories?
One genre that he absolutely loved and read widely in was history. And so I think that starts to show. He wrote the Hyborian Age. So he'd written, a couple of the Conan stories, and then starts drafting out the Hyborian Age and drawing the map and what everything looks like. And it went through 4 different iterations. So it kept developing and expanding. And so a lot of that has to do with, that ability of creating that background, world making, it just, and again, I mean, he was the first because Tolkien came after him, like you said, and we'll have to look at him as, the first to kind of do the world making and have the different, countries and languages and people and populate everything and then place his characters in that world. But in many ways, Howard was actually before Tolkien. So, and, there's so many different influences on him that, so I have a whole chapter on just the influences of on Howard and his writing and the many different genres. But I think all of these things contribute to, his ability to create these worlds. The other thing I like is that, and I appreciate this because this is the kind of writing. When I read something, I like to hang my hat on something. When I read a lot of science fiction, they come up with all of these names for the world and the people and the language, and it takes you out of, yourself. And a lot of people like that. That's why they enjoy science fiction. When I start seeing a page that has all of these words that, just they're foreign or they mean nothing to me, I get turned off. I'm like, oh. So Howard would use tropes, names, variations of the country's names. It's just a shortcut to be able to, you already know all of this stuff, right? As soon as he says, Stygian, oh, okay, you start thinking about Egypt and things like that. And so you can fill in everything. So he doesn't have to spend a lot of words explaining the, long 10-page background, And so his descriptions are extremely short, extremely precise, and very vivid. But again, he relies on those little cues that we already are familiar with.
Yeah. But I think I was getting at what kind of access did he have to those resources? Being in Texas, in the early 1900s.
He moved around a lot, and he was a book reader, an avid book reader. So he would read anything lying around, and he would borrow books from people and things like that. And then, of course, there's the in his younger years, during the summer he would go raid the schoolhouses for their bookshelves. He would sneak in there, break in there, whatever it took, and borrow the books. So it could be an apocryphal story, but it's kind of cool. And so he's reading all of this stuff, and it really wasn't until his late teens that all of a sudden he discovers the pulp magazines, and that he could read these kinds of magazines, and adventure became one of his favorites. So resources were scarce, but eventually when he was able to go down to Brownwood, so he went down there to finish off his last year of education because Cross Plains didn't have it. So to finish his, primary education. And so in Brownwood, they had a Carnegie Library, they had bookstores, and at the time that Howard lived in Cross Plains, they had neither, no bookstores, just
that's what I was wondering. Yeah.
Yeah. And no library. So
we got some praise for your book here from Michael Bond. He's got a massive YouTube channel. I've tried to invite him over for conversations, but he keeps ignoring me. So, Michael, come on. No, but he appreciates the hard work that must have gone into the book. So,
yeah, I was extremely just flabbergasted over watching his video. The first when he had gotten the book. Which I had told my publisher, I said, you got to send the book to this guy because he's got a heck of a following. And they said, okay. And, but then he came out, of course, for the week that I'm waiting for him to come back with something, before he had only skimmed through it. Mm-hmm. And I thought, well, okay, after he reads it, is he still going to appreciate it as much? And I was just blown away. And my wife was impressed too. And takes a lot to impress her.
But you manage. So I don't know how much we want to delve into what led to his ultimate decision. but I guess since we're talking about Robert E. Howard, we can't skirt the issue. He died very young. Was he 30? Was he
30 years old?
30 years old. Took his own life. What were the events leading up to that tragic decision?
Wow. So that's one of the things in my book. I have multiple threads that I keep adding on to, and I keep adding on to, and I keep adding on to, so that there's an understanding that by the time he gets there, you have a good understanding of how it ties into, again, his seeking his personal freedom. You know, it's not simple to say, oh, I want to be free, I'm going to kill myself. It's nothing like that. That's too simple. The other thing that, you know, starting with the first biographer, Elsbreg de Camp, you know, well, he was a mama's boy and his mama was dying and he just couldn't face that, so he killed himself. It's like both of those are too easy. So part of it is he was seeking his own freedom, and he started getting this inclination about, if things don't work out, then I'm going to commit suicide. And you start seeing hints of this along the way. So it's kind of, you know, it begins with when he had been down in Brownwood attending that last year of school. A couple years later, one of his schoolmates committed suicide. And he was curious as to why he would do that. And that's what he wrote in a letter to his friend, Clyde Smith. From there, you can see him thinking about it a little bit more and a little bit more and a little bit more. And he starts talking about, you know, if I can't make this writing game work out, then, you know, I'm just going to end it. Or another point where he talks about, you know, I don't want to go out as an old man falling apart, etc. I want to go out in my prime. So you're seeing these indications. What stops it in a way, and you can start seeing this with his relationship with Novelyn Price, because around that time, his mother's health starts to decline. And in a way, what he did is he put his personal freedom on the back burner because of his sense of duty to her. And he took care of her and did an enormous amount for her. His father was a country doctor, and he was tending to poor people who could usually only pay in produce or meat or things like that, not cash. Mm-hmm. So the family didn't have a lot of cash until Howard started getting paid cash for writing the stories. So Howard was the cash, you know, source for the family. But he's spending an enormous amount of his cash on taking care of his mom at the sanitariums and the hospitals and the doctors. And so she's dying of tuberculosis. And at the point at the very end where he finds out she's not going to survive, she's basically going to pass away. Now I think that sense of duty was, you know, lifted from him. And now he could carry out what he had done. But there's other threads. You know, going into the writing game to be free sounded great, but you were a slave to the editors because the editors often would reject his stories. And sometimes it made no sense. Some of the stories they rejected, kind of like some of the stories that Farnsworth Wright rejected of Lovecraft. Like, why did you do that? Those were awesome stories. But there, you know, editors are facing various things as well that writers often don't know. So you're writing for a penny a word, which means you got to keep writing. You know, most people in their careers, right, you start making more money, you command more money, you know, you start sitting comfortably. But for a pulp writer at that time, you made a penny a word. And if you didn't write, you didn't get paid. And just because you wrote didn't mean it was going to get accepted, so you weren't going to get paid if it wasn't accepted. Yeah. So that's a lot of stress. And these people lord over him. And again, you know, it was an insult to his personal freedom. But there's one other one. And this one I stretched I think, further than anybody else had put this. At one point, he was concerned about his health, his inclination toward women. So this was in his like late teens, early 20s. He just was not, as inclined. He was kind of a late bloomer, is what, we would say. So he was afraid of that, he may have some problem, inability with his testosterone or, things like that. So he went to a doctor, and the doctor gave him a diagnosis of sexual anesthesia, which was actually at that time in the 1920s it was now a dated diagnosis. But again, it was a country doctor. So, it's you understand why they're kind of behind in terms of the medicine. So I had to research what sexual neurasthenia is. And I discovered that there were actually multiple books on it, which really surprised me. So Elsbreg de Camp in the first biography tried to paint it as, see, this is another kind of his mental illness, and he has sexual hangups and sexual problems and, things like that. Well, it turns out in reading what sexual anesthesia was, it started in the late 1800s during America's Industrial Revolution time period. And it was a disease of modern man. It was a lot of the jobs no longer had a physical element to it. They were more mental. And they had to work longer and harder, and life was busier. And this started causing them to have problems mentally, and they were becoming depressed, and they were starting to withdraw, and they didn't feel good. They didn't feel like doing anything. And what it turns out, it's chronic fatigue. So when Howard's writing for, days on end straight, and having to write to make money and then having editors reject, he was suffering in Cross Plains, Texas, which was still very much, a rural, not a modern place, but he was suffering the same conditions of modern man, and nobody in the area knew it. And by that point in the 1920s, it was no longer called sexual neurasthenia, and it was no longer a medical diagnosis. It was now a psychological diagnosis. Freud had come on with psychology. And so as a result, it started realizing the problems of, mental illness. So that's what he was suffering from. And the way to get out of that is to go on vacation, to exercise. But the problem is when you're facing chronic fatigue, you don't want to go anywhere, you don't want to do anything, and you certainly don't want to exercise. And so it becomes this downward spiral. And he was facing that quite often, especially when his mother was dying.
Brian says here in the comments in the chat that probably he was a person suited for another time period.
Yeah, especially for Texas, 1920s, 1930s, when he's writing and living as a writer, he should have been in New York City or something like that, right? Because then he would have been among other writers, etc. But he's living in a very rural, very blue collar, type of occupations. Oil workers, farmers, peanut farmers. That's what the area was.
Do you think he felt this sense of isolation?
Oh yeah,
Contributed to that.
Yeah, he talks about it a lot. And he gets angry over it. And of course, he's different.
Yeah.
Right. He's different. So everybody looks at him very differently because he's not doing, he sits at home and he writes. That's not a job. That's not a real man's job. Well, what's he doing? He's just a lazy bum. And that's how people were thinking of him.
Yeah. I feel that comes out in a lot of his stories, that sense of isolation. Yeah.
Uh-huh. Yep.
So, very easy, cheap sort of psychology going on here. But do you think that Conan was his alter ego, like what he would have wanted to have been, that sort of alpha male in that society that valued that kind of male traits that he didn't exhibit necessarily?
Yes, a little bit, but that's kind of too simple.
Yeah, but that's me. So that's the best I can do.
Yeah, I mean it's good enough, I guess, because there's a lot of Howard in Conan. He had also been writing a lot of realism pieces, and there's actually some realism in the Conan stories. And even Howard made a comment, that may sound strange, but by putting more realism in, you also see a development of his characters. So Solomon Kane was a character rooted in real history. And then there was a development because that kind of constrained him with what he could do with the character. So then he develops King Kull, right, from Volusia. And now he's got this fantasy world that's connected to something real or believed to be real, Atlantis. And so it's not real history. It's kind of a pseudo history. So he's got a little bit more flexibility. But then when he created the Hyborian Age in Conan, he had much more flexibility. And the character becomes more simple. And he also talked about at one point in a letter that it represented a lot of the people that he knew, a lot of oil workers, blue collar workers, etc. And so you can get that kind of, work hard and free spirit and do the job. And, so there's a lot of things that go into the development of where he got to the point of creating Conan.
Mm-hmm. Obviously, for anyone wanted to delve into the person of Robert T. Howard, they should check out your book. But we have a question here from Darren in the chat. Have you watched, and if so, what did you think of the movie, The Whole Wide World? I couldn't finish it.
You couldn't finish it?
I couldn't finish it. No.
Okay. It's a little, I would say, bombastic and over the top, and it's also very compressed. So there's a lot happening, and they really fill a lot in there. But by and large, it is from everything I researched, and I mean, actually read it. I mean, if you read the chapters on Novelyn Price and, that time where he was dating her, and of course I get a lot of the information from Novelyn Price because she left a memoir, which the movie was based on. And it didn't hurt too that it was actually one of her students because she was a teacher of rhetoric and public speaking, English, kind of, that area. And one of her students grew up to become a movie director. And he's the one that wanted to do her memoirs as a movie. And that's how it came about.
Yeah.
So it's a good movie. Again, it's, it's compressed and maybe a little over the top.
Yeah. That's what took me out. Those sort of quasi-dream sequences where he's imagining and, the stories and stuff. I wanted it to be a bit more grounded.
There's stories of him, and everybody remembers this, of him walking down the street where he's running a story through his mind, and then he would stop and he would start, shadow boxing, and he was in his own little world, imagining these stories. So in some ways, that's what they're trying to convey in the movie. A little over the top.
I've got a few questions from people in the community that have emailed me, and then maybe we can talk a little bit about the aftermath of what happened after Howard's death. This one's from Steve, our Grimdark Overlord over at pagechewing.com. What's your favorite Conan story? What would be the one that encapsulates the character there?
Tower of the Elephant. I love the Tower of the Elephant.
I suspect. Yeah. Is that, because it sort of links to, next question I have from Diego Rios. He's from Honduras. He's subscribed to the channel. The connection between Lovecraft and Howard's worlds, because Tower of the Elephant, some people have made a connection that elephant is actually Cthulhu. So was there a connection? Did they share some kind of world building there?
Yeah, because I mean Lovecraft and initially the exchange. It's fun reading the exchange between the two of them. I mean, it's entertaining because at first Howard is he's like just all awed to be talking to the H.P. Lovecraft and to be writing him and him writing him back and he was Mr. Lovecraft and. But as it goes along, it's like that veneer goes away and they start having arguments and debates back and forth. And he becomes more critical of Lovecraft. But one of my favorites too is the whole Cthulhu mythos, so-called Cthulhu mythos, is that he wrote one of the letters to Lovecraft, and he was inquiring about, what's the basis for this, like where would I find more information about this mythology? And Lovecraft wrote back and said, I hate to disappoint you, but it's just all made up by me. Mm-hmm. And so Howard was a little disappointed over that. But again, all the writers within Lovecraft's circle started writing within that, or taking elements and putting it into their stories. A lot of times the Tower of the Elephant, the elephant is not, or the elephant-like creature is not connected to Cthulhu, but I think it is. Mm-hmm. I think there is a strong connection there. But the whole thing is Howard, and that's, when Howard started writing the early Cthulhu stories, he was trying to imitate Lovecraft, mm-hmm. and they're good. But when he finally kind of stepped away and said, "I'm going to do my own thing," I'll still have a little bit of the Cthulhu, kind of stuff in there. I'll have some of the names and the books, etc. I'll drop those names, but I'm going to kind of do my own thing, like the Black Stone. I mean. All of a sudden it's pure Howard, and even though he's pulling stuff from Lovecraft, it's pure Howard, and they're great.
Mm-hmm. Got another question from another subscriber, from Nestor Calero. Any particular reading order?
For the
Conan
stories.
Most people seem to only care about the Conan stories.
Yeah, I mean, my favorite reading, and I do this for all authors, is I like to read from when they first publication. Sometimes if that differs a little bit with first written, so sometimes stories first written are published later. I like to read them in the sequence in which they were written. Mm-hmm. If they are the original and not have been edited because they're later, published stories. So. Sometimes I mix and match, but I usually like to typically in published order.
Yeah. And I'm back again from Diego. So what is canon? Because we've had a lot more Conan stories from Robert Jordan, the comics. There's been a lot added on. So do they also belong to the canon?
Yeah.
Jared, what are you holding up again?
I like John Hawking's work. I think for pastiche writers, Chris is definitely recent. Yeah, and he's good. I like his stuff. But I don't like all of the pastiches, or so.
So again, what is canon? Just Howard's works, or any particular...
Canon to me is Howard's works, and that's it. The rest is all imitations of, some get close, but most of them are just, it's not Conan.
Mm-hmm. And then the last question from Dale Cooper, another subscriber, and then I think that sets us nicely into the next part of the conversation, is, so who owns the rights to this written work, or are they in the public domain now?
So I was up at Windy City in Chicago for the Pulp and Paper Show, and I was sitting with Paul Herman and from the Robert E. Howard Foundation, and he's the one that is kind of the chair president. or what the title is, of the Robert E. Howard Foundation. And so he's the one in the know, and he also happens to be a lawyer who also happens to have done a lot of copyright stuff. So he explained it all to me, and I know that the original stories, those, if you look at the lack of renewal, because at the time they were published, there was a certain amount of time, 28 years, and then you could renew for another 28 years for the stories. But by then Howard was dead, and nobody within the estate renewed the Conan stories. So the original Conan stories, as far as I understand, are in the public domain. But here's the trick. They registered a trademark on Conan. And so trademark copyright works very differently than traditional copyright. So it gets really, really complicated at that point. But pretty much the entity that now owns, the characters, you really should get permission from them. And but it gets really complicated. There is on the website, The World of Robert E. Howard, written by Stolley, or created by Stolley, and it's run for the Robert E. Howard Foundation. There is a tab on there, copyright, questions or, answers or a review of the entire copyright. And a lot of that comes from Paul Herman explaining all of this. And so that's a good source to go to, but tread lightly.
Okay. We have a question here from the chat. Was Lovecraft depressed after Howard's death?
I'm not enough of a Lovecraft biographer to know that, so that's why we need the other. Yeah, there we go.
That's why we need to get you with David. That's right.
I would say he was quite taken aback and very sad over it. How much depression, and then of course his life took a nosedive because of the stomach cancer and his death the following year. So. I mean, from an amateur standpoint, I could say, yeah, I think it was depressing on him. The same for Clark Ashton Smith, etc.
Jared, have you got?
Well, my favorite is A Witch is Born. I love that one.
That's a great one. I won't argue.
I had some questions. So after when the he got really popular when they came out with the Frazetta paperbacks. But I never knew how much did that vault Howard's post-death career into giving him that mythological status that he has today. That was probably the start of it from what I've read. But then after the Frazetta paperback reprints and stuff like that, how significant was that to making Howard the icon he is today?
Having not researched it, so I'm only saying my kind of perspective. So my book is The Life and Times of a Texas Author.
Yeah.
And unlike the other biographies, I do not spend a lot of time, I almost spend no time on his legacy because, to me, it would require another book. And I wanted to give more time and dedication to his biography. I do have the epilogue, which kind of wraps things up, but it really is his funeral and how people saw it, how his fans, the readers of Howard at the time, how it impacted them. And a lot of them, I would argue, were really depressed over his death.
Okay.
And then at the very end of the epilogue, I talk about his legacy, but it's very short. Yeah. But having not researched it, but, read quite a bit about it, the Tolkien in the U.S. in the 60s, all of a sudden the the illegal paperbacks of Lord of the Rings come out, and it is a hit sensation. So after that, of course, everybody's scrambling to find other things that are, fantasy, but more for adults. And of course, Howard comes out and they publish the paperbacks, which were again based upon the Gnome Press, which had released the hardbacks in the early 1950s.
Oh, okay.
And so they had collected up all of the stories, the original stories. And after that, L. Sprague de Camp became involved and started doing the early pastiche. I did do a research piece, which I thought was interesting, is that originally they wanted Lee Brackett to write the Conan pastiche. And this was in the early 1950s, but she was thinking about it. You see the exchange in the letters. She was thinking about it. She might have done it. Mm-hmm. But then all of a sudden she started writing screenplays for Hollywood. And, So they paid better.
How big was his audience when he was writing and he was alive?
He had a following, that's for sure. If you read in the Irie, and that was the other thing, the readers. So I collected up, every Weird Tale magazine, the Irie. I had all of them, and I read all through them looking for anybody writing about Howard. And so then I created a document for myself that had all of those quotes in there. So that was a quick resource guide for me to be able to integrate those quotes based upon the stories. So I get a lot of, people at the time, Weird Tales is actually publishing and they're reading Howard stories at that time. I mean, imagine if you could be doing that. It just, because those stories would blow you away even more, because this is the 1930s.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely.
And I mean, the praise, overwhelmingly, it was all praise. There were some detractors, but most of them were highly, they loved the writing, they loved his poetry, they loved his prose and how well he wrote. People compared it to the Iliad and the Odyssey, and so they were enamored. And then in the 60s, there was that revival with the Lancer paperbacks. And then eventually the Ace paperbacks, which is what I picked up in 1979. They're still up there on my shelf somewhere.
I think you sort of kind of half answered my question, but I wanted to ask you, in the same way that we owe to still have Lovecraft to this day, to August Derleth and founding of Arkham House and keeping the flame alight, who was it or what was it that kept Howard's work alive after his death? Because the pulp magazines were for quick consumption, and so who do we owe the credit to keeping the stories going?
Number one person is Glenn Lord, who was the executor of the estate for Robert E. Howard. And kind of a long, weird way, but ultimately he's the one that becomes, in charge of the Howard estate. And he was a Howard fan, but he also was interested in reading Howard, not any of the pastiche stuff that had, already come out with the Gnome Press books. And so while L. Sprague de Camp was taking it in one direction, Glenn Lord was really about preserving his papers, his letters, his, the original stories, the drafts, collecting any information about Howard, himself and what Howard wrote, not bastardizations of it. That said, I do have to acknowledge that L. Sprague de Camp, that paperback series was phenomenal. I mean, it caught my attention. A lot of people that I talked to, it caught their attention. So L. Sprague de Camp does get some of the credit, although he was quite demeaning toward Howard. He said, these were okay stories and they were okay written, but, he was willing to make money off of Howard, from those paperbacks, being the editor. But I think a lot of it was he would demean Howard because my guess is, I don't know this, but that those paperbacks made DeCamp more money than his own writing. That's my guess. I'm just guessing.
Yeah.
So that probably insulted his ego, and DeCamp had a huge ego. But that becomes very clear. And so I think it was demean Howard so that my reputation increases. So my thought.
Got a question from the chat here from Brian about what were Howard's personal spiritual beliefs, if he had any at all.
It looks like early on there was some Christianity. It comes out clearly that he, was familiar with the Bible. So that was probably due to his mom. His mother was Methodist. His dad was Baptist. So, in America, in the South, that's a huge battle. Usually a source of confrontation. So it was interesting. You'll go to small towns in the South and you'll see on one corner, on one side of the street is the Methodist church, and on the other side of the street is the Baptist church. And they did that on purpose. But pretty much you can kind of tell that he questions a lot, which again, there's nothing wrong with that. But it kind of comes down to, there's one quote where he says, there's just not enough for me to believe there is a God, but there's not enough for me to say there isn't. So,
kind of agnostic then.
Yeah, I would call him an agnostic.
And this question, I don't understand it. I must have missed something out, but I could have put it there. The thriller episode Pigeons from Hell. I don't know what show that is. I don't know anything about it.
This is, what's the name of the show? It escapes me. From the 1960s.
Okay. Oh, wow.
And they actually, it was Boris Karloff is the host, and I cannot think of the name. That bugs me. Again, remember, I didn't write about the legacy. I wish I could think of the name. Anyway, Boris Karloff, 1960s. The episodes, it was 2 seasons. The episodes are all online. At the very end of the first season, they did Pigeons from Hell, and it has to be. I would argue it is the most faithful adaptation of a Howard story ever. And it's a good episode, and a great story. I mean, if you were to ask me, you asked me what my favorite Conan story was. If you asked me what my favorite horror story is, Pigeons from Hell, definitely. That is a fantastic story.
Okay. That's clear up for me. Clearly, there's some cultural transatlantic gap between yourselves and myself. So
I was not familiar with that at all.
Okay. Google Pigeons from Hell, 1960 on YouTube, and you'll probably get the episode because you can watch it on YouTube.
Oh, okay. So what is your, besides Conan, which one's your favorite character of Howard's?
Probably Solomon Kane, because of the complexity of Kane. I like the draw upon the name, King Solomon, and of course Cain, little variation, but Cain and Abel. I like the the motifs, the supernatural. I don't know, it really works for me. My oldest son, who is very inclined toward religion, that's his favorite character, is Solomon Kane. He really doesn't like Conan at all. And then my younger son, who's a forester now, he likes Conan. He likes actually all of the characters, but so I'd say Solomon Kane next. Cull after that. So Conan, Solomon Kane, Cull. I like his moodiness, brooding, always brooding, kind of, I don't know, that dour. I would imagine if being a king, that's not a fun job. No.
Gerald, what's your take on Solomon Kane?
He's my least favorite character of the canon. But interesting still. Not like I mean, I find all Howard's writings interesting. So, I liked Howard's take on that period in history.
Okay.
Most definitely, but I like Bran McMorn. I think he's a really interesting character. The Pict and his um his presentation of the Pictus culture and stuff like that during his time, and being a kind of against the Romans or what have you. So that's one other than Conan. I think that's my favorite one. But yeah, Solomon Kane. I have a hard time getting into those stories. They're not my favorite ones.
I was half okay with them until he introduced the African juju
No.
witch man, and it's like, oh no, like I really I understand at the time period Africa was this big unknown thing, so I understand that, but from sort of, whereas Conan works perfectly well, I think probably Solomon Kane is the one that has dated the worst out of all of that.
Yeah. I mean, when I was growing up, I was not religious at all. So it came later in my, 20s before I, actually became something. So I used to always say that, instead of being, raised by the Lord Jesus Christ, I was actually raised by the Lord of the Jungle. So I used to watch every Sunday morning. I would watch the Tarzan movies that were on, and absolutely love them. So the Solomon Kane, that didn't bother me.
That fits in that mold. Yeah,
it fits in that mold. Yeah. So,
yeah.
I mean, it was actually an advantage too, because my dad bought and sold old antiques, in the 60s, 70s, 80s, into the 90s. He was an antique dealer, and he dealt in old paper. So we had pulps. I read the pulps. We had Big Little books. I read the Big Little book. So I grew up in the late 1920s and 1930s. I mean, all of that, the Westerns, Gene Autry, Roy Rogers, Big Little books, Little Orphan Annie, Captain Midnight. I just, all of this, I grew up in that time period, but then I also grew up in the 70s. So it's kind of a weird mix, but
I think that ties in with the next question from the chat. His Western stories, I'm not familiar with them. What's your take?
They're good. They're good. They're really good.
Yeah.
They're
pretty good. I like those. Yeah.
Yeah. I think, and I'm not the first to say this. There's a lot of people that think this, that he was kind of moving away from weird tales and the Conan stories. And I don't think it was because he didn't want to write them anymore. I think it was more because Weird Tales wasn't paying him. And it's like, well, I need to go to, write for venues that actually will pay me. So Weird Tales was in arrears for paying the money that they owed him for stories that had published. And so he was starting to lean and write more on the Westerns. And he also had this vision about, writing the great Western novel, probably the great Texan novel. And I think he would have ultimately gone that way. And his stories, at that point, when he was writing them, if you read the pulps with the Westerns are still in that mindset of the cowboy, and he's the law, and he's in the white hat, and the bad guys are in the black hats. And yeah, they shoot at each other, but nobody really gets hurt. And, it's kind of that, oh, gee, shucks. And when Howard started writing them, they were more gritty. They were more realistic. There was a little bit more realism in them from the Old West. And he loved reading about the Old West history. And so he was educating himself on that. And he was surrounded by people that, had lived way back in that era, and they told him stories as he was growing up. So he had a very different take, which ultimately, had he stayed alive, about 5-10 years later, that's when the Western stories became more gritty.
So hearing this, and to kind of try to bring it back full circle, his quest for freedom seems to have been a slight Promethean, pushing the rock up the hill and rolling down again, because he, from what you say, he kind of was forced to write Westerns because the Hyborian tales weren't paying or weren't selling. He needed the money. So he never really quite achieved or reached that freedom that he so longed for.
Yeah, and again, because, even though he was his own boss in terms of his time and when he would write and, what he would do, I think more and more he was discovering that he was becoming a slave to the editors, and they were fickle. And, so I don't think he was against writing the Westerns. I think he enjoyed writing those, and he had written some early Westerns, in his younger years. None of them sold. He had a couple of them published. One of them was published in the local newspaper as a serial. And so, but again, he had to go where the venues were. At one point, boxing stories.
Stories, yeah.
Yeah, they were his bread and butter. Sailor Steve Costigan. He was selling those left and right. So, and he loved boxing, so it fit perfectly. And so he told the, story of Sailor Steve Costigan sailing, in the high seas in the Pacific and going into port and getting in, boxing matches. And the most shocking thing for me when I first read those as a teenager, they were funny. And I had been reading Conan and Cull, and there's a little humor in there, but there's not a lot. And I start reading the Sailor Steve Costigan, and I'm like, wait a minute, this is kind of funny. But the weirdest, and I was totally convinced, Breckenridge Elkins. Have you read any of those? Okay, they are in the tall tale. They are tall tales, right? Paul Bunyan and Pecos Bill and that kind of vein. And they're set, they're Westerns, but they're comedic Westerns. And they're the really tall tales. And they're, just laugh out funny. And I picked them up because they were from Robert E. Howard. That's the name that was on the cover. But I was totally convinced as a kid, there is no way that the author of Conan wrote these comedic Westerns. No way. So, it was probably 5 or 6 years later that I discovered it was the same author. And I'm like, wow. And then Mark Finn, he's the one that, where I first learned, he's another biographer of Robert E. Howard. Wrote a good biography too, by the way. It's a very different style of biography, but I really enjoy it. But anyway, he's the one that came, conveyed that Breckenridge Elkins was one of his biggest moneymakers, and he sold more stories of Breckenridge Elkins than he did of Conan. And they're like, wow, really? But there was the one magazine, that Pulp magazine that he was publishing in, and there was a Breckenridge Elkins story in every month's issue. That didn't happen with Conan. So, right. Once he landed, and he was giving the editors what they wanted, the readers what they wanted, and he was writing, something he enjoyed. He had a lot of success, but then it peters out, right? Fans get, I'm bored of this, or editors go, well, we've had enough of that. And, or Howard runs out of ideas, like, oh, these are getting harder because I'm having a harder time coming up with stories for these characters.
Or he ran out of time because he wrote a lot of stories.
Yeah, 11 years. Just all of what he wrote is just, I got bookshelves of all the books up here of, what he wrote. And it takes up a bookshelf.
It's incredible.
It's amazing. 11 years. So,
Jared, any concluding questions? Anything you?
No, I think we covered a lot of Howard territory here, without actually just reading the book live. but but yeah, I think this it was pretty good. I love talking about this stuff. It's great.
I've learned a lot for sure. It's been thoroughly enjoyable. So, Dr. Oliver, where can people find your book and your work, and where can they find you?
It is, I understand that right now in Europe it's a little difficult. I saw a post on Swords of Robert E. Howard that it was coming available at the end of this month on the England's Amazon page.
Mm-hmm.
So, although somebody said it was listed as paranormal, it's a paranormal, book. Got me. So, and I understand some other in Italy, it's not available yet. So my relatives over there can't get it. Of course, it would be in English, and some of them speak English. But Amazon, Barnes and Noble, bookstores, pretty much it's out there. You can order it directly from the University of North Texas Press. So my publisher.
Mm-hmm. And okay, just one last question, and then we'll say our goodbyes. I'm a soccer dad. I've got duties tomorrow morning. It's evening time for me. Okay. Final question from Darren. They obviously had to talk about the movie Conan the Barbarian. Well, couldn't let it go.
It came out in 82. I absolutely loved it I was, let's see, 15 years old. Oh yeah. Oh, it was great movie. Yeah. And I've probably watched it a half dozen times at least, if not more. But it's not really Conan.
No, it's not based on any story, is it?
Nah, not really. There's a few little threads that it seems to be based on, and some of them are like DeCamp pastiche or Lynn Carter pastiche, and it's just it's.
He does get crucified once, like on the that happens in A Witch is Born. But
I wish somebody would, just like Jackson. I can't think of his first name, but the guy that did the Lord of the Rings. Yeah, Peter Jackson. He did the Lord of the Rings, not the Hobbit. Lord of the Rings.
We don't talk about that.
Yeah, we don't talk about the Hobbit. Yeah. So Lord of the Rings, that series was, it was just lifted from the book, put on the screen, and it was excellent. And I wish somebody would just do that with Howard. The Tower of the Elephant, when you read that opening, it's panning in from the cityscape, and then it comes down and eventually it gets to the street level, and then it goes inside a bar, and it's like, oh, this is cinema written all over it. Just open with that, and then, Conan kills the guy and storms out, and, this is great. This is great. In fact, I could even see where the candle goes out in the room, and of course the guy gets slain, so you would hear it, but the screen would be just totally pitch black, and then you'd hear the guy dies, and the canvas gets thrown back, or the piece of leather, whatever's covering the doorway, and then you hear him go out, and then all of a sudden you have the screen credits, the title, and everything, and then you move on from there. It would be phenomenal. But
I've always said that
you can produce it.
I know. Yeah.
The problem sorry, I was going to say that
go ahead.
The problem with modern adaptations is that they don't come from a place of love for the source material, like Peter Jackson did with Lord of the Rings.
Yes.
All the other adaptations we've had afterwards have come from a place of, if that made money, we can make money with this other series, and they're not working because of that. And just the passion that you're showing now, the way you are imagining and viewing that's we need someone to do just that, isn't it?
Yes, definitely. And again, the Hollywood types. I understand. I'm going to produce this movie and make this movie, I want to make the decisions on what's done. So let's change the character and let's make it more of this, and we'll make it more of that, and we'll change this, and we'll change that. Well, that doesn't work. Let's do, and that's how you end up with a Conan movie that's not a Conan movie.
Yeah.
So,
but that original movie did bring a lot of people to the books and comics later, so it did its job, because it brought me to them.
Okay.
So once after seeing the movie, then I got into the comics, and then I started getting into the prose, so it all snowballed.
I love going to Howard Days and listening to people's story of when they first discovered Howard. And for some, it's the comics. For some, it's the movie. For some, it's the books. For some, it's the role-playing game.
Oh, yeah.
And so it was really, another guy I spoke with, it was the Solomon Kane box game. He didn't know who Solomon Kane was, but he liked the box games that company was producing. So he bought it, played it, loved it, and then started reading the Solomon Kane, and it took off from there.
Nice.
So lots of great stories.
Indeed. Fantastic. And just to finalize this, Jared, where can people find you and the stuff you get up to?
You can find me at the Fantasy Thinker YouTube channel, and you can find me on pagechewing.com, where I'm involved in plenty of podcasts there.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think, unfortunately, it's come to the time where we have to finish here. I think all three of us could carry on talking for a lot longer. But anyway, thank you to everyone that popped in the chat during the stream, to Darren, to Brian, Michael, Antonio, anyone that will be listening to this later on the podcast platforms. Thank you, everyone, ever so much. Take lots and lots of care, and we'll see you soon. Bye.
Thank you for having me.
Always a pleasure.